Why should you attend our upcoming online Zoom conference on Austrian economics? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we address that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that you all know brings you the principled case for the libertarian philosophy. And I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to be with you and our viewers and listeners.
Okay, so we've got some good news for y'all. I think you might get excited over this. We certainly are excited. We are putting together a new online conference that consists of a series of weekly presentations for about 6 weeks. We got 6 speakers lined up. And the theme of the conference, I don't think anybody's ever done this in the libertarian movement. It's one overall theme that all 6 speakers are going to be talking about. And the theme is going to be the impact of Austrian economics on my life. And so every speaker is going to be talking about that theme. And these are some of the leading libertarian Austrian economists in the movement. And so each one of them is going to be relating his story to you, how he discovered Austrian economics, the impact that it's had on his life, why it led him into this direction of Austrian economics, and then some of the principles, the important principles that have really greatly impacted each person's life. And we've got a great lineup. Let me see if I can remember all 6. We've got Richard Ebeling, one of our speakers, premier Austrian economist. In fact, Richard was the Ludwig von Mises Professor of Economics at Hillsdale College, and also head of the Foundation for Economic Education, which had a strong connection with Mises, Ludwig von Mises, and the Austrian school. And we got Larry White, who has previously spoken in one of our conferences on monetary policy. Pete Boettke, one of the leading Austrian academicians in the country. Joe Salerno, who's associated with the Mises Institute. And Ben Powell, who's a young Austrian. I think you're going to really enjoy hearing him. And who am I missing, Richard?
How many was that? I think that was 5, right?
I think that was 5. So let me see. I'm missing one.
And they'll never forgive you for getting their name.
Boy, no kidding. I hope they don't find out.
You're in trouble now.
Mark Skousen.
Mark Skousen.
Yeah, we got the honor of having Mark Skousen, who is the entrepreneur genius behind Freedom Fest every year. But what a lot of people may not know is he's one of the premier Austrian economists in the country, and has written fantastic books about this subject. So each one of them is going to be talking, sort of giving his personal story, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. It's going to occur this year on Thursday evenings, beginning in October. Each speaker will talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So we think it's going to be a really fun thing. We've told each of the speakers we don't want any formal presentations. Just make this informal. Tell us your story about how Austrian economics became a major part of your life. And the idea, Richard, is to just bring Austrian economics to our audience of people that at FFF, as well as new people. Of course, we'll be recording it and putting it online. But it's really to introduce people to Austrian economics, why it's been so important in the lives of these particular Austrians, and why people really should delve deeper into this philosophy. What's your take on what we're doing here, Richard?
Well, one way of seeing the significance of this is that 2023 and 2024 mark the 50th anniversaries of a number of events that, hearing how Austrian economics affected prominent economists' lives in the way we're doing, it sort of marks that occasion. First of all, it was on October 10, 1973, 50 years ago, that Ludwig von Mises, the prominent and leading Austrian economist of the 20th century, along with Friedrich Hayek, passed away. So that was a milestone, the passing of what was considered the dean of the Austrian school for many decades. It also, in 1973, is the 50th anniversary of the publication of a book that was a major catalyst to get a serious and more academic focus to Austrian economics after many decades of being in the wilderness. And that was Israel Kirzner's 1973 book, Competition and Entrepreneurship, which restated in a very pertinent and relevant and timely way the ideas of both Mises and Hayek on the nature of entrepreneurship, competition, the market as a dynamic competitive process. And then looking to 1974, 50 years ago next year, two major events occurred. In June of 1974 was the first Austrian Economics Conference, sponsored by the Institute for Humane Studies, held in a small town called South Royalton in Vermont for a week's time, and brought together about 40 young Austrians, many of whom became very prominent in the movement over the following decades and up until now. And this was a catalyst for the revival of the Austrian school, with lectures at that seminar, that week-long conference, by Murray Rothbard, Israel Kirzner, and Ludwig Lachmann, who had studied with Hayek at the London School of Economics in the 1930s. And then, to everyone's total surprise, in October of 1974, 50 years ago, now soon, the Nobel Committee announced that they were awarding the Nobel Prize in Economics to Friedrich Hayek. Out of the blue, this leading contributor to the Austrian school in the 20th century, the author of The Road to Serfdom, in the 1930s, the leading critic and opponent of Keynes over what was the causes and cures of the Great Depression, a major contributor, as Mises was, to the challenging the workability and the desirability of a socialist planned economy, who had been in a wilderness in a good part of the post-war period because of the dominance of Keynesian economics and other currents in economics, interventionist directions, got this Nobel Prize next year, 50 years ago. And that was a major rebirth and awakening of awareness of the Austrian school, not only in the wider intellectual and policy community, but as an inspiration and a catalyst and an interest for many of these younger Austrians who are now not so young, which are going to be participating in this program. And that's what makes him an important event. The significance of the Austrian school in this broader sense was a variety of things. First, economics had become a narrow discipline. In many ways, it still is, of a hyper-mathematized analysis in a series of simultaneous equations of an arid concern with equilibrium in the market in an abstract, almost surrealistic way, having often little to do with how the real world works. And economics concerning such things as the economy as a whole have become dominated by Keynesianism, which basically focused on the economy, aggregate output, aggregate employment, aggregate price levels, and how government monetary and fiscal policies can manipulate them. And the Austrians, who had always emphasized the intricacies of how markets work and how inflations distort prices and wages and misdirect resources and bring about imbalances, and that can only be corrected by allowing the market the latitude and liberty to overcome the misdirections that the prior government policies had created. All of that was lost in what one economist called the Keynesian avalanche that covered everything, including the Austrians. And this revival of the Austrian school, helped by this conference 50 years ago, the Nobel Prize to Hayek a half a century ago, all of this brought about a rebirth of thinking about how the market works, what is appropriate, if any, government policies concerning the economy as a whole, a rebirth of an interest in the Austrian school and its relevance and importance. And from a more strictly classical liberal libertarian perspective, the insights that the Austrian school provided, both in the earlier decades of the 20th century and then with its revival to the present, is that the fact is the market is greater, the market is more important, the market is more effective and workable than any attempt to micromanage the economy, either with government regulations, interventions, monetary manipulations of money and credit, fiscal attempts to stimulate things by lowering or raising taxes or running budget deficits or not. The Austrians said the economy is too intricate and complex and dependent upon all of the individuals in the society to coordinate themselves through prices and market competition than any heavy-handed government approach can ever hope to master, manage, or correct if it sees problems occurring. And that was a renewal of an appreciation of the free market perspective. Of course, it's an exaggeration to say only the Austrian school. There was the sister free market school, the Chicago school defined with Milton Friedman, but there were unique qualities and characteristics in this last half century that the Austrians brought to bear, as I tried to just now briefly allude to, that made it so important that a revival occurred. Many of the people who have been invited to be speakers either attended that first Austrian economics conference in June of 1974, for example, Joe Salerno and myself, or ended up being students of those people who spoke at the conference. For example, Peter Boettke came to know and interact very much with Israel Kirzner, as I did. Knew and interacted with Ludwig Lachmann and Murray Rothbard, and therefore that link, the older Austrians, Mises and Hayek, this now next generation of that time, Kirzner, Rothbard, Lachmann, and then this next generation that included Joe Salerno, myself, Mark Skousen, and then Peter Boettke and Ben Powell, for example, who were the younger ones who studied with the students who had been the students of them, such as Don Lavoie, who Boettke did his dissertation under at George Mason University, for instance. All of this is what makes it very interesting to now understand how did the reemergence of these Austrian ideas, beginning in this active way half a century ago, mold, create the interest and the imagination of the type of speakers that we're having at this online conference, how they were inspired, what twists and direction it gave to their thinking, and how it led to their own contributions and attempt to influence then the next generation through their own writing and teaching. And in my opinion, that's what makes this opportunity to have such an online conference with such an important group of people coinciding perfectly with a half-year anniversary of that first Austrian conference, and then, of course, Hayek winning the Nobel Prize.
Well, that's a great summation, and it really puts things into context with respect to this upcoming seminar. But, Richard, we're so accustomed to using that term as libertarians, Austrian economics. I mean, it's just sort of like a natural thing. Oh, well, I love Austrian economics. And, for people that are just getting exposed to this, that may sound kind of weird. Like, Austrian economics, how come they're not American economics? I mean, where does this term Austrian come from? And so would you kind of tell us a little bit about how that term came into existence and why it's still around today?
Well, it's because the Austrian school began in the late 19th century in the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. Its founding by an economist named Karl Menger, who was a professor at the University of Vienna, and who in 1871 wrote a book which has a very mundane title translated into English. Obviously, it was written in German first, Principles of Economics. But in that volume, he did a number of things. First of all, he challenged the foundations of the older classical economists, starting with Adam Smith. And that was the value of goods were based upon the quantity of labor that had gone into it. If a good has a particular price in the marketplace, it's merely its monetary expression of the amount of labor hours that have gone into it. For example, if it takes a hunter a day to down one deer, and it takes a trapper a day to capture 2 beaver, then the logical exchange ratio between deer and beaver, representing the labor time of a day gone into it, would be 1 deer for 2 beaver. And what do you do with goods that take very little labor to go into, or in a sense are just available to practically be picked up? but have a high market value. And what do you do with things like air, which obviously is essential to life, but you don't really have to, other than inhale, you don't have to do much labor to get the amount that you want and everyone else respectively desires and needs. What happened is that Menger developed the idea of the theory of subjective value, that what determines the value of a commodity is not the quantity of labor that had gone into it, but its relative importance to the user. It's because something has usefulness to a potential user that he will then see the worthwhileness of devoting his time, his labor, his resources into its manufacture. So it's the value of the end product that assigns value and importance to using resources to produce it. It's not that the fact that labor and other things have to go into something that the good then has value. That has it sort of backwards. And he was challenging that. And then the idea that decisions are made at the margin. We don't make either or categorical choices in most instances. We make incremental or marginal choices. Think of it this way. You have a wardrobe in your closet and you have a sum of money and you're thinking of adding to your wardrobe. And you ask yourself, well, I have like 5 shirts and 3 pairs of pants. At the margin, which would be of relative greater value to me? The marginal value or usefulness of one more shirt or one more pair of pants. And therefore, you weigh these margins of evaluation. When you go to the supermarket and when you get to the checkout counter and you have your cart filled with food, you have a certain amount of meat and eggs and bananas and bread and cans of peas and whatever the individual wants and puts it. But what determines this relative combination, which is different than the relative combination in the basket of the person in the next aisle over? If you look over, what are they buying? It's this discussion at the margin. I would prefer some optimal or preferred combination of at the margin, this amount of this in terms of how many of them, how many of these, how many of these. And that's how the way people make choices at the margin. And that explains how people make choices, and that the only person who knows what's important to them, therefore, in general, what they want and the relative values they place upon having different amounts, are individuals themselves. I can say anything I want about Jacob Hornberger, about his choices and values, and boy, do I have thoughts about that. But who am I to tell Jacob Hornberger what he should value or not? If I think he's making wrong choices or wrong decisions or eating things that are not perfectly nutritional, I can talk to him, I can recommend him, I can give him my point of view. But at the end of the day, who am I to tell another person what's valuable and important to them? And if they make what I consider wrong choices, then I feel sorry for them. But it'd be arrogance, hubris, presumption, pretense of me to assume that I have the knowledge and the right to tell another person how to peacefully and honestly go about his personal affairs or his interactions with others. Those are sort of the normative implications of that. And then just extending that, the other aspect of Austrian economics, and so just highlighting one, was Hayek's emphasis on the role of prices. We think of prices as things where we pay a price for something, we accept a price for something if we're selling. But Hayek's point is that what prices do more than anything else is convey information. Knowledge in society is decentralized, diffused, spread out in little increments in each of our minds. Because each of us sit in our own little corner of the world, a world that now has over 8 billion people in it. And how much knowledge do I have compared to all the other people in the world? And think of all the knowledge that other people in the world have that might be useful to make my life better in some way. So how do we interact in the marketplace to communicate what it is I'd like and the relative values I place upon them? How do people on the other side of the market tell us what they think they could make a product that we would desire, at what price they could sell it, given the value that other businessmen and entrepreneurs are placing on labor and resources to manufacture, and the prices of those factors of production emerge out of the bidding process. And prices then convey information, enable us to calculate, compare. Well, would this be profitable? Would this be loss-making? Would this be the least expensive way to make them, to minimize the expenditure of scarce resources that could also be then used in other desirable ways at the same time? This is what the price system does. And that's what central planning and government regulators can never know enough about, in the minute and particular and changing knowledge that it only exists in the minds in little bits in each of us. And it is better to allow each of us to interact and communicate with each other through this price mechanism than to presume that one person could learn all this, aggregate it, sum it, digest it, combine it into some total plan and then give orders back down to tell each and every one of us what to do before some of the knowledge may be out of date, because things change all the time. So the Austrians therefore emphasize the importance of leaving markets alone. I like to sometimes say, following Hayek's line, that if we do view prices as a communication mechanism, that we talk to each other, then the freedom of market prices should be guaranteed by the First Amendment. Freedom of speech. Now, we talk about freedom of speech in the conveying not only of words out of our mouths, but the written things on a page, right? Those little symbols on a page. We assign a meaning to the letters and the sounds to them combined to make words, and we connect those symbols in their combinations in various ways, and we call them sentences, and the sentences convey ideas to our head as we're reading on the page. Well, that's freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Well, another mode of communication for people to share ideas, values, interests, intentions, importance of things, is to convey these things in the marketplace through the instrument, the communication medium of prices. And if prices are a communication medium, as talking and the written word on a page are, then free market prices should be freed from any attempt at government to regulate, control, or abolish them, because they're a fundamental right of freedom of expressing our ideas to others for the betterment of all of us in the long run.
Yeah, when you were talking about the Keynesian model, I was thinking back to my college days, because I was an economics major at Virginia Military Institute, and they were teaching this Keynesian model that you were describing, and charts and graphs and mathematical models and stuff. And I remember thinking, gosh, so when you get out of college, if you want to go and see how the economy is working, you got to do these charts and graphs and supply curves and demand curves. And when I discovered Austrian economics came alive for me, because they were talking about human beings. It's really the study of human beings interacting in a marketplace. There was no charts and graphs or anything. It was really just an examination of how a free market operates. And so if you want a shorthand rendition of what Austrian economics is, to me, it's the free market. How does the free market operate? In which real live people are interacting with each other with investments and spending and buying and producing and so forth. And that's, I think, why one of the reasons it was so attractive to me, not only because it was a very principled exposition of free markets, but it was showing how people raise their standard of living, how they communicate with each other, as you point out with the price system. I found the whole thing fascinating, even to the point I won't be giving a talk in this seminar. So I'll tell you my little personal story here. You know it, Richard, that when I ended up living in Dallas, I sought out the head of the economics department at the University of Dallas, where I ended up teaching a course in law and economics, and asked him to tutor me in Austrian economics. And he says, well, let me look at your reading list. And I showed him what I'd read. And he says, I think we need to go back to basics. And let's go back to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and start there, because he understood that in the history of economic thought, as you sort of alluded, you got to go through the classical economists to reach a solid understanding of Austrian economics. So we did a chapter by chapter analysis of Wealth of Nations and David Ricardo's principles, some of John Stuart Mill, till we reached Menger, as you pointed out. And we studied Menger's principles of economics that you mentioned, and then we got to human action, and that's when I met you. And the head of the department, Sam Bostav, said, I'm now turning over your tutorial to Richard, because he knows more Austrian economics than anybody of your age group. And then I later went to the Foundation for Economic Education as program director, where you later served as president. And one of the highlights was that I was able to audit 2 classes by Israel Kirzner, who you mentioned, who is one of the premier Austrian economists. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, Kirzner got his doctorate under Ludwig von Mises. And so Kirzner let me audit 2 of his classes at NYU. He had tenure there, one in the history of economic thought and one in Austrian economics. And I mean, I can't tell you how exciting it was to be able to sit in on these classes. And he let me actually participate with questions and answers and so forth. I mean, asking questions of him like all the other students. So economics came alive for me. And I think that's the big impact that it has on most libertarians. But I do want to ask you one question, and I don't want you to steal any of your own thunder from your talk. But that conference in South Royalton, Vermont, to me is a fascinating thing that you were able to participate in that. I had not discovered libertarianism yet in 1974, and the fact that you were there, I assume you're probably going to be covering that in your talk, because I think it's really a transformative event. But could you give us a little bit of a taste there? Like, how long was the conference? Who were the speakers? What was the tone? How many people attended? That type of thing?
Sure. First of all, this was the brochure for that first conference.
Whoa, wow.
So this is 50 years old.
That's
I still have
fascinating.
it. And it was announcing a conference on Austrian economics, sponsored by the Institute for Humane Studies. And it was from June 15th to June 22nd, 1974.
This is a week-long conference?
A week-long conference.
Wow.
Here was the inside of the brochure, and the speakers are listed as Israel Kirzner, Ludwig Lachmann, and Murray Rothbard. Hayek was supposed to be there as a distinguished guest, but he didn't make it because he had come down with an illness, nothing serious, but he couldn't make the trip across the Atlantic. He was teaching at the University of Freiburg in Germany at that time. And it says, and there were about 40 people here. The sessions addressed by the conference leaders will include informal afternoon sessions, which will give other participants an opportunity to present papers or lead discussions based on their current research. And the topics that will be discussed will be market process versus equilibrium, Austrian methodology, the theory of capital, the theory of money and business cycles, the history of the Austrian school, and the philosophical and ethical implications of Austrian economic analysis. That is what the conference was about. I should also mention that the papers delivered by Rothbard, Kirzner, and Lachmann were published not too long afterwards in a volume called The Foundations of Modern Austrian Economics. That volume came out about a year and a half later, 1976, edited by the conference organizer who IHS had arranged to do that, a man named Ed Dolan. And that book is still in print from, I believe, Liberty Fund. It certainly can be downloaded as a PDF, to my knowledge, for easy read and accessibility on a tablet or a computer or your phone. And this shows the way Kirzner, Rothbard, and Lachmann were attempting, for this audience of approximately 40 people, where did Austrian economics come from? What are its philosophical as well as economic foundations as a logic of thought, as a way of looking at the world for understanding how markets work in comparison to how more of the mainstream economics of the profession views it? What are the implications in terms of economic policy, particularly with a discussion, in contrast to Keynesian economics, of the Austrian theory of money, of the business cycle, of why booms lead to busts, that it's better to leave to the market to self-rebalance and correct than rely upon government to intervene fiscally or through more monetary expansion that really exacerbates and does not assist a recovery from the prior inflation and the start of the recession. What else? Oh yes, well, it was a small town in the middle of nowhere. It was a hotel surrounded by homes, and I had taken. I don't need to talk about this in my presentation, so I can talk about it now. Personally, I'd been invited by the Institute for Humane Studies to attend this, and they paid my way, but bus fare from, I was living in Sacramento, California. So I took a Greyhound bus ride from Sacramento to New York for 3 days, which was a unique experience. Strange things occurred on that bus for 3 days, which required an X-rated code assignment to this LA session. You cannot believe what people do in their seats, either by themselves or with others, when they're on a bus for days. I blushed. I was hyperventilating. And then, having arrived at the Port Authority bus terminal in New York, I then had to catch another bus up to South Royalton, Vermont. So that was a kick, and I went home the same way, by the way. But I should mention that after I left the Austrian Economics Conference in South Royalton, Bettina Bien Graves, who was a longtime staff member at the Foundation for Economic Education in what was then their long headquarters in Irvington on Hudson, about 20 miles north of New York City in Westchester County. Bettina and I had been communicating for a long time, and I told her I'm going to this Austrian conference. She said, well, immediately right after that Austrian conference, we're having a week-long seminar here at the Foundation for Economic Education, student seminar. I will arrange that they waive the tuition, the room and board will be provided. So I went from the Austrian conference to a week-long fee conference, where I got to hear Hans Senholz, another prominent Austrian who, like Kerzner, had done his dissertation under Mises. Henry Hazlitt was a speaker there, the well-known free market journalist and author of Economics in One Lesson. And of course, lectures by the staff members, Leonard Reed, the founder of FEE, Ed Opitz, a resident theologian, Bettina Graves, Paul Poirot, the longtime editor of their monthly Freeman magazine, and so on. So it was a delightful 2 weeks with a coming and going on a Greyhound bus. And it brought together those 40 people, and it's not an exaggeration, many of those 40 people who themselves were in graduate school or who had just recently completed their PhDs and were just starting out in their academic career, were brought together. They were just young guys in their 20s for the most part, 30s a few. And many of these people became the leading members of what today we call the Austrian School in the last decades of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. And so people like Peter Betke, for example, studied with Don Lavoie at George Mason University. I know he'll talk about this. And Don Lavoie was one of those people who was with me and with Salerno at that Austrian conference in South Royalton. So there's like these lineages, like great-grandparent, intellectual grandparents, grandparent intellectuals, parent intellectual parents, and then their students and kiddies, intellectual kiddies. So there are these human connections that bind all these people together. And in the case of people like Joe Salerno, just to mention the other one of the speakers in the online program that will be starting soon, that involves friendships and intellectual connections that go back a half a century in many cases. So it was a profound and useful conference. I'll just tell one other thing here is that I had never met Murray Rothbard before, though I had read all of his books. And I had in my image from him, because it was like an old picture on the dust jacket of one of his books when he was a young guy. So I had this picture that there's this thin, short, tall, and serious scholar. Thin, tall, and serious scholar. And so I arrived in South Royalton. Other people started arriving, including Murray Rothbard. And here's this short guy, like 5'4" or something, rotund, and cackling and laughing and telling jokes and political anecdotes. I mean, talk about a shock. And Murray would hold forth every night. Everyone else is trying to go to sleep. No, he would hold like little salons in like a center conference room. And he would tell political stories and critiques of other economists. And he would sing political songs of every ideological persuasion you could imagine. So he would hold court. And so then it would be getting to like around 1, 2 in the morning. And his wife, Joey Rothbard, who had already retired, would often come down and say, Murray, your first lecture is at 9 o'clock. You need to go upstairs and get some sleep. Oh, Joey, I don't want to go to bed yet. Murray, you're going to bed. It's bedtime for you. And she'd come and take his ear, but I don't want to go. I have something more to tell the guys. So it was a unique and hilarious experience. And to give you an idea of what the South Royalton town was like, I would occasionally because I wanted to pick his brain. I would have these conversations between sessions with Ludwig Lachmann, who had been born in Germany, had to leave Germany in 1933 with the rise of Hitler, had studied and finished a second master's degree with Hayek at the London School of Economics, and then taught for many years in South Africa at the University of Witwatersrand and began being a visiting professor at NYU with Kerzner's sponsorship. So I would take these little walks with him around the town, and there was a square in the center of the town with an old, Union Civil War soldier on a pedestal, and Lachman had a gravelly sing-song voice, and I said to him, "Well, what is your impression of the venue of the conference?" And he said, "Mr. Eberling," this is how he talked. "Mr. Eberling, it's been very interesting to find out what life was like in America in the 19th century."
Well, so did they ever explain?
It was a great experience.
Did they ever explain why they picked this small little town in Vermont as compared to New York City or Chicago? Or
okay, it was originally supposed to be at Dartmouth College, but some logistical problem occurred that Dartmouth either couldn't or didn't want to be the sponsor of it, because you're going to have all these crazy economists with these bizarre ideas. And Ed Dolan, who was really trying to originally arrange it at Dartmouth, couldn't. And he knew this fellow named Dario. God, I even remember the guy's name, Dario, who was planning to set up a law school in the small town of South Royalton. And Dario had bought the hotel and was buying up some properties to try to build a law school. I don't even know if he ever ended up building a law school, but that became the alternative location, because Ed Dolan knew this guy Dario, who owned the hotel where the conference could be held, and in surrounding buildings, people could be housed if there weren't enough room in the hotel. For example, I wasn't in the hotel. I was in some two-story house about a block away, but the buildings were very old, like what Lachman said, 19th century, I think. And so my bedroom was on a slant, and the head of the bed was just below the window. So I had to sort of like hold on to the sides of the bed so not to slide out the window. And then another attendee was a well-known Austrian economist named Suda Shenoy, whose father also had studied with Hayek at the London School in the 30s. And she was in the hotel, and she said that and the hotel had not been refurbished yet, so it was really an old hotel with facilities. She came down one morning saying that something terrible had happened in the shower, but it was too shocking for her to convey what. So I mean, it was a kick, and then it was totally isolated, and at night you'd hear dogs barking like in the perimeter. And so Murray, in one of these evenings he's holding court, someone interrupted and said, "Murray, I just was trying to make a telephone call from a public phone in the hotel. The line is dead." And Rothbard said, "The line is dead. The place is surrounded by German shepherds. I think they're coming after us. Oh my God, it's the end of the Austrian school."
Yeah, Dolan's book, I discovered libertarianism, I don't know, 5 or 6 years after this conference, but Dolan's book was one of the first books I got. Yeah. And it's an absolutely excellent introduction to the Austrian school. Right. I'd recommend it to anybody today. Right. And you can imagine it would be a nice introduction, given the fact that this was the revival. This meeting represented the revival. And you mentioned Bettina Graves. I had the good fortune of working with Bettina. She's one of the premier Austrian economists. When I worked there at FEE for 2 years, I mean, I would go over to Bettina's office in the morning or afternoon and say, "How's it going this morning?" And she's an elderly lady, but so nice and so genial. And her desk was just filled with papers. It was really fascinating. But she had attended all of the meetings of Ludwig von Mises' seminar at New York University. And I don't know how long that was, 10 years or whatever it was.
25 years.
25 years, and had kept verbatim notes of
Correct.
every
I read some of them. Meticulous.
Yeah, and so
Ridiculous.
I kept telling her, "You've got to get these written up and published. They're invaluable." And I don't know if she ever did that, Richard.
Excerpts have appeared. I have copies of some of the ones that she typed up, where she talks about Hayek's contributions, about Joseph Schumpeter, about some theories of Bombavrich and Bombavric's theory of Austrian capital theory. Some things, and where Mises had given some talks on inflation. But they're all housed, I believe, in the Mises Institute. But in toto, other than these excerpts, they really have not been published. But they were fascinating. But I think we don't want to give too much away about everything, Jacob, about everybody's experiences or about that conference, because I'll have nothing to talk about when I give my
Well,
talk, Joe. So let
exactly,
me know.
exactly. And anyway, we've gone way over time. I hope you all have enjoyed the conversation here. Again, our conference online series starts on Thursday, October 6th. Tune in. It's going to be at 7 p.m. Eastern time every Thursday after that for 6 weeks, 6 speakers. And Richard, I greatly enjoyed the conversation, but I have one last question for you. Did you have to take the bus back to California?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. On that note, we'll wrap things up. Thank you all for tuning in. Great. Richard, I greatly enjoyed the conversation. I look forward to talking to you next week.
Take care.